Let's now begin the part 2 of the discussion on concepts in sociology. Earlier on in part 1, we had discussed the question, is there a pre-conceptual, is there a pre-theoretical? In other words, we as members of society, do we not already have concepts about social institutions, culture, values, histories? We all have certain notions. And, these are discussed and debated every day within the family, within schools, within neighborhood. And I'm going to take 4 examples. 4 examples to discuss and elaborate what is the difference between common sense understanding and sociological understanding. The 4 examples that I'm taking is mother, father, child, family. Now, all of you anywhere in the world would know and have certain images and associations with the word mother, with the word father, with the word child, with the word family. There would be images, there would be values, there would be sentiments and emotions attached to that. That is natural. Now I'm going to try and show how those images in our everyday life, common sense ideas about mother, have to be interrogated from a sociological perspective if we are supposed to have an understanding of what motherhood means or mother means in sociology. What are the familiar images that are invoked when we use the word mother? We associate the very term with the idea of motherhood, with which we are familiar in our society. Some associated tasks are connected with it, some associated ideas. So when you look back, many of us who belong to more or less traditional patriarchal families, you think of your mother and you think of your mother cooking food for you, mother in the kitchen, mother caring for you when you are ill, mother in domestic life, mother sacrificing for others, mother who's always in a giving mode, mother in a self-denial mode. Now, very often you will realize that these are historically constructed attributes to motherhood. So the idea that, for example, that a young woman doesn't know how to cook would defy just not the idea of motherhood, but defy the idea of womanhood. But is this something which is natural? And the argument from sociology would be that it is not natural, it's historically and socially constructed. So in many privileged homes where you people had outsourced the task of cooking, caring, domestic life, denial and sacrificing to people from less privileged backgrounds, from marginalized background, would not be associated with these terms. So you have in our own culture, the culture of dai, where you would have other women breastfeeding the baby, and that would be only possible for privilege, where they could actually hire somebody from some other community who would need that kind of occupation in order to sustain themselves and their families. So when we start debunking this notion of mother, and debunking does not mean denying, debunking does not mean that you are sort of challenging all that you feel for your own mother. That is valid and that is honest and that is true. But when we do sociology, we have to realize that mothers belong to specific historical contexts, social, political, economic context. So very often, say, when I was correct examination answer sheets, and many young people would write that about, supposing it was about role conflict, which is a concept in sociology, role conflict, they would say that earlier there was no role conflict in our society, but when Indian women began to work and when mothers went out to work, role conflict began between their role as a mother or a wife, as a caregiver, and their role as a worker, a teacher, a doctor, or whatever. Now, if we have to interrogate it from a sociological perspective, the issue would be that when they say that earlier there was no role conflict, it is something which I'll discuss later, but I want to introduce this word. It is a question of cognitive invisibility. Because women in our societies have always worked. They have always worked. So women from communities, Adivasi communities, would be producers of, of food, of, intangible heritage like medical knowledge, of seed, protection, of, cultivating the soil, of forestry, of multiple occupations, which was central. So they did work. You had peasant women who always worked. They worked in the fields, they cultivated, they tilled, and when they were not allowed to till, they may have been involved in extended agricultural activities. They always worked. They worked in urban sectors as, maybe, service sector, or maybe in the unorganized informal sector. Maybe there were people who were building, tying rakhis or doing embroidery within their household, but working. They could be working as domestic workers among more privileged middle-class families, working as cooks, working as cleaners, working as people who looked after children. They worked. And the mother, whom we usually associate, if you come from a privileged background, with the middle-class mother, also worked. She worked within the home. She worked in domestic work. But this notion that the mother did not work is embedded in the associated ideas and images that we have with mother. Cooking, caring, domestic life, sacrificing, giving, self-denial. The idea of motherhood is embedded in that concept. So when we start studying sociology, and I'll discuss this a little later, we will see how would we approach the concept differently. Likewise, the concept of father, head of household, earning, work, responsibility, in charge. But have fathers always been like that? Are there women-headed households in our society? What happens to those many families where the male member has to migrate for work and the woman is left behind to run both the domestic work of the household as well as the whatever little livelihood occupations which are involved there? Who looks after those houses? Who takes care of all these questions which are there? So is the father always the head of the household? Post late 1970s, after the 1975 report of Towards Equality, there was, and I've repeated it in many lectures, a great interrogation of redefining necessarily the head of the household as a male member. So government reports, evaluation reports started having an option where the head of the household could be a father, but the head of household could also be a mother. But habits die hard. I've just retired, but even as I retire after, 33 years of teaching and work before that, when I had to file up my, papers, there's always wife of or daughter of, something which perhaps a male member who retires does not happen. So these concepts are institutionalized and embedded in government reports, in very bureaucratic apparatus. They become part of ourselves. This is the manner in which common sense permeates categories which are within a sociology or within any kind of social sciences. In sociology, however, the story is very different. So whereas we would have a very different kind of motherhood in our everyday life, or fatherhood as I developed, we would have images like this, as though this is the only image that you could have of a family. But you know very well that you would have many other images of a family in a slum, a single migrant woman, and there are many single migrant women because very often they get certain kind of jobs more easily in the urban sector, and the men follow them, and the men come as dependent. Very different kinds of family which would be existing. But this becomes the normative family. This is how a family ought to look. And the people who make these pictures are obviously in a more dominant position in a society. In sociology, however, what we have to learn is that family is much more than this. There are different families, different being an important term, and unequal families. Now let me define family in sociology, and you will clearly see how it is a little different, but at the same time how common sense ideas of the family, and common sense ideas are usually the dominant common sense, can creep into ideas of the family. Now defining family in sociology. Family is a socially recognized group, usually joined by blood, marriage, cohabitation or adoption, that forms an emotional connection among its members and that serves as an economic unit of society. Sociologists identify different types of families based on how one enters into them. So one kind of definition is saying that, look, it has to be recognized by blood, that is either by descent, that I am my mother or my father or my grandmother or my grandfather's child, or by marriage, that you have a relationship, a husband and a wife, would be by marriage, which is not by descent. Cohabitation or even adoption. And so you have various ways of entering family. In common sense, you assume family means blood and nothing else. And you have an emotional connection among its members, which is very true. Many of us are very deeply and emotively connected to our family. But as sociologists, we cannot forget the point that very often families can also be places of abuse and malpractices, domestic violence, child abuse, neglect, mental torture. And this is a recognition that our normative ideas should not blur us to it. We cannot invisibilize the empirical because we have certain ideas about the family. The economic unit of society, I'll come back to this. What do we mean by the economic? The family is an economic unit of society. One simplistic understanding is you have the father who's earning, the mother who looks after the family. Is that what we mean by it? What is the relationship between economy and the family? I'll go back to it a little more in detail as we move forward. In fact, I'll be going back to one of the greatest pioneers of sociology, Talcott Parsons. His understanding of the family, his understanding of the family and its co-relationship with industrial development and social mobility. What did it say? What did it forget? What was it visibilized and what was cognitively invisible? Sociologists also, apart from different families, unequal families, they have different types. They identify different types of families. I've already mentioned, are you born into a family? Are you married into a family? So you have two terms, a family of orientation, a family of procreation. A family of orientation refers to the family in which a person is born. A family of procreation describes one that is formed through marriage. These distinctions have cultural significance related to issues of lineage. Most importantly, the question of matrilineality, patrilineality, who becomes a legal heir, who does not become a legal heir. Why is, say, the whole question of, legitimate or illegitimate becomes such a cultural issue in our society? Why do we have honor killing? Why are certain kinds and boundaries, prohibited in marriage? There are disputes within sociology. Now, there is a certain kind of, I would say, lay and not a very informed view that, sociology has too many debates and disputes. And if you have to be a kind of empowered discipline, you should have one definition. How can we have one definition when we don't even have an agreement between different members of society? The mess or the conflict or the tensions or the excitement or the fun that exists within society, the dynamics of society have to be captured by the discipline. It is the strength of the discipline that you are able to capture this diversity and disputes in its conceptual definition. Concepts are just not for learning, but concepts are analytical tools or props which help you to understand the nature and structure of society. In sociology, we do not accept any definition as taken for granted or forever. It is nothing is forever. Knowledge is until it gets invalidated. Knowledge is constantly enriched like culture. It is historically specific. What is true today may not be true tomorrow. This happens even with the physical sciences. Linked to ecology, family is linked to ecology, family is linked to economy, family is linked to production, family is linked to relations. So when you had a kind of colonially mediated industrialization in India, you had a lot of migrants who went from the villages to Bombay as factory workers, who went from the villages of Bihar to Calcutta as jute workers. It was primarily men. It was partly ecology in the sense that economy in the sense that where are the centers of production and job and production relation, which impinged upon the nature of family. Migration, economy, family have a very close relationship. Ecology, natural devastation when people have to migrate, or ecology in the sense that you cannot have large extended families in a very fragile ecological terrain. It would be very different. So there's a relationship between family to ecology to economy to production relations. Yet in common sense, family is just certain image, like I showed, happy family, mother, father, grandfather, grandmother, one daughter, one son. However, reality is very different, geographically specific and culture specific. Let us take some examples. When dominant common sense shapes sociological conceptualization, I've been trying to communicate that there is a close relationship between common sense and sociological concepts. The relationship exists because we as sociologists are also members of society and have inherited certain common sense, and very often we blur the distinction between our inherited common sense and our sociological conceptualization. Parson, for example, argued that men were the instrumental leader while women were the expressive leader, and that both were necessary to run a family and to run an economy. So men earned, men were in charge, women did the cleaning, the caring, the emotional looking after. So men carried out discipline and earned money while women cared and nurtured and raised children. How true is that? Can we interrogate it? Can we say that in such a great sociologist like Parsons, his ethnicity, his historical location of the Americas of early 20th century made him define family in a particular way? So what is a family? Let's take the example of America, where Parsons was located. Very often in a family, a husband, a wife and two children, maybe even a pet, is seen as a model traditional US family. Like the picture I showed you a little while back is the typical traditional Indian family. But what about families that deviate from this model, such as single parent household or a homosexual couple without children? Should they be considered families as well? And in many societies they are due. In other societies there's contestation, disagreements as well as challenges, that we too are family, we are emotionally connected, we are bonded, we are economic units, we feel very strongly, we care, we nurture. Now, Talcott Parsons, if you have to understand this matter of cognitive invisibility and why did he err if he did, you have to locate him. So concepts are not mechanical forever givens. Concepts are historically located. Talcott Parsons, for example, was born in 1902, 1979, essentially 20th century, essentially at a period in his working life when America was in ascendant post-World War II, a flourishing economy. But he was also living in an America where there was segregation. How did he miss out black families? How were they disappeared? Like in India, for example, we have that example I gave you, that in India women have just started working and therefore you have rule conflict, is a matter of cognitive invisibility. So concepts in sociology have to visibilize. The task of a concept is to visibilize hidden reality or to question the partial nature of the way we look at the empirical world. And I'm going to give a certain source of a particular writing to say, how did these female-headed black families emerge? Why were so many black families in America female-headed, unlike the middle-class white family, which was usually earning male-headed family? What was the urban experience? Because sociology looks at causal relationships. The link between family structure and social mobility has been a topic of considerable sociological speculation. For years, there has been a running controversy among scholars working in the area of family whether certain kinship arrangements are conducive to success in industrial society. So Parson would say nuclear family helps in industrial society. In our society, in fact, the moment we had an industrial society through colonial mediation, we had a situation of broken families, migrant families, the women and children in the villages, the men in the cities. Now here, if we have to understand the origin of the female-headed family, we have to go back to slavery. Now Parsons said that the most prevalent family in society, the nuclear household, emerged at the time of industrialization in response to demands of the economy, to a highly flexible, mobile, emotionally bonded small kin unit. So other families are not emotionally bonded. There is so much value loadedness into this. Parson contends that extended family restricts mobility, so you have to have small families. Extended family fosters a sense of collectivity rather than individualism, an emphasis on personal qualities rather than on general performance, and in his understanding of achieved and ascribed identity in a modern industrial society is the individual, and the individual who has to emerge, and at the most the family can only be the immediate nuclear family. Is this true? Is this not? We have to have a comparative understanding of this. We also have the question of women. And for example, you have again an American, 1953, who felt that mother's place is within the house and juvenile delinquencies arise when the mother is working because psychological separation from mothers. There's a huge problem with this because you would have many female-headed households, particularly in other communities, and you wouldn't have juvenile delinquency. Anne Oakley, in her classic work, Sociology of Housework, 1974, I urge all of you to look into it, gives the example of Alor, an island in Indonesia. To refute Bowlby's statement, in small-scale horticulture societies, women are not tied to their offspring and there is no apparent side effect to it. So you have contestation, and contestation leads to greater and greater clarity and enrichment of knowledge. Anne Oakley, in the Sociology of Housework, she sees the intimate and close relationship necessary. She does not necessarily see that it is an intrinsic part of family. Research has proved that mothers return to work after childbirth, and children of working mothers are less likely to be delinquent than non-working mothers. You have questioning, new researches, new hypotheses, trying to figure out how much of those hypotheses stem from our own prejudices and how much of it is, stems from a scientific interrogation. Now, I have given you earlier, so when we say the term child, we talked about family, we talked about mother, we talked about father. Now, if we take the concept of childhood, and new images, child playing, children playing, images of playing. But again, if we look at it from a sociological perspective, we realize childhood itself is historically constituted. In different periods, childhood meant different things. The idea that children must not work, children must only study, go to school, listen to their parents, be obedient, not waste their time in unproductive activities like playing is historically constituted. Even the industry of children's wear. Now in any mall or advertisement, you will have advertisement of children. Sometimes even preteen, teen, babies, newborns, and there's a whole industry of clothing. But traditionally, most children just wore what their parents wore in a smaller scale. So if the mother wore a sari, the child also wore a sari, and likewise, or if you wore a dhoti, even the little boy wore a dhoti, or etc. So you have certain images of child which are associated from very urban middle class projection, but because it's the urban middle class who writes books, writes advertisement, depicts the worldview, so to say, that becomes the common sense. Now, if you look at it from a sociological perspective, childhood may mean very different things. Look at what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. Child marriages arose because there was curtailment of livelihood, job loss, no money, and there was insecurity of families with young girls and they wanted them to get married. So UNICEF has shown there will be additional 10 million girls globally who will be at a risk of child marriages over the next decade. The risks associated with the child marriage do not end with girls who are married before 18. It leads to an intergenerational cycle of poverty that adversely impacts the economy. It puts girls at risk of being denied access to education, which impacts their autonomy and their access to health care. What I'm trying to show to you is that the way we look at father, mother, family, childhood is very different in our lay, taken for granted world and in a self-conscious sociological world. So you have debates which took place in America about whether you have a typical American family, and you had debates within India. Debates here questioning the structural defects in America of the black family, and others who said, look, it is linked to the history of slavery, which destroyed the black family. We also have questions in our part of the world where you have the Indian joint family and certain questions being raised. Very often we say in India, everybody lived in a joint family before and now it's nuclear. But A.M. Shah, one of the stalwarts of studies on family and kinship, has shown it's a stereotypical understanding and that there is many kinds of families in our society and it's not a unilinear shift from extended family. There is a dearth of scholars, he writes, with good reporting and observation. We have to report, we have to observe. We can't just plant the ideas that we have inherited. We have to also draw from sources. What do the census say from 1820? There has been no unilinear change. So concepts in sociology have to be buttressed with the sources that we use to build up this. So we cannot say that joint family is necessarily disintegrating without giving reference to source, data, method. So we have to, I will not repeat because I have already addressed Durkheim, who said we have to constantly question ideas and perceptions, preconceptions and ideology, because we already have those received ideas and sociology has to challenge this. It's not easy, especially because there are emotional quality in a concept like family or kinship. This makes it very difficult for us to examine phenomena to scientific examination like religion or family. Sociological concepts, unlike common sense concepts, will shock you. If Peter Burgess says, if you want to be a good sociologist, you have to be ready for some cultural shock. You have to be ready for some adventure. You have to defamiliarize, you have to debunk, you have to have a comparative perspective, and you have to be constantly alert to specificity of context. I do hope that I have been able to communicate the specific nature of sociological concepts and why they differ from common sense concepts, and why sociological concepts gives us the analytical tools to examine the dynamics of society. Thank you very much.